April 19th, 1978, 7:23 a.m., 1718 H Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. The steam from Margaret Chen's coffee cup spiraled upward in the cold morning air as she stood at her kitchen window, 3 blocks from the White House. Through the Georgian row house's warped glass, she watched her neighbor, the polite man with the pristine Ford Granada, fumble with his briefcase on the front steps. Something metallic clattered onto the brick sidewalk. He lunged for it with unusual urgency, scanning the empty street before pocketing what looked like a small cylindrical object. His breath formed quick, nervous clouds in the 42-degree air. Margaret had lived in this neighborhood for 11 years, watching diplomats and junior staffers come and go, their routines predictable as the cherry blossoms that would arrive next week. But Rudolf Herrmann, who insisted everyone call him Rudy, had a rhythm that didn't quite sync. He left for his advertising job at irregular hours. He received no personal mail, only trade magazines and catalogs. His wife Inga spoke with an accent Margaret couldn't place, something that shifted between German and something more Slavic when she grew animated at neighborhood gatherings. The sun cut across Lafayette Square, illuminating the bare trees and the White House's north facade. Rudy straightened his tie, a conservative burgundy stripe, and walked toward his car with the deliberate pace of someone performing a rehearsed action. Margaret noticed his shoes, expensive leather Oxfords, European-made, too fine for a mid-level advertising consultant. She'd worked at the State Department's protocol office long enough to recognize the tells. Foreign service officers bought American shoes to blend in. Everyone else trying too hard bought imports. She set down her coffee. The cup left a ring on the stack of Washington Post newspapers she'd been meaning to recycle. The headline from 3 days earlier caught her eye. FBI intensifies search for Soviet illegals network. The timing of her suspicion felt suddenly less paranoid and more like responsibility. Margaret picked up her telephone, the avocado green rotary model that came with the house, and dialed a number she'd been given years ago when she left state, a number for unusual observations. The line rang 4 times before a neutral male voice answered. "I'd like to report something," Margaret said, watching Rudy's Granada pull away from the curb. "It's probably nothing. But my neighbor has a Russian accent he's trying to hide." What Margaret Chen couldn't know, what nobody in Washington's intelligence apparatus had yet pieced together, was that she'd just identified the most successful illegal resident the KGB had ever placed on American soil. A man who'd lived within walking distance of the White House for 7 years while running a network of agents that had penetrated the Department of Defense, the CIA's Soviet division, and the Pentagon's nuclear war planning staff. The metallic object Rudy had dropped wasn't a key or a lighter. It was a miniature Minox camera containing photographs of classified documents that would, within 6 months, trigger the largest counterintelligence investigation since the Rosenberg case. The coffee on Margaret's windowsill grew cold as she gave her statement. Outside, the morning commute began. And 3 blocks away, in the White House Situation Room, the president's daily intelligence briefing made no mention of the threat living close enough to see the executive mansion's lights burning late into the night. The official story, as Americans understood it in 1978, was reassuring in its simplicity. Soviet spies existed certainly, but they operated under diplomatic cover at the embassy on 16th Street, where the FBI's surveillance teams tracked their movements with bureaucratic thoroughness. The KGB sent officers posing as trade representatives or cultural attachés, and the FBI's counterintelligence division logged their meetings, photographed their contacts, and occasionally expelled the most aggressive ones. This was the visible war, fought with protocols and reciprocal ejections, a manageable chess game where both sides knew the board. What neither American intelligence nor the public understood was the depth and sophistication of the KGB's illegal residency program. Operatives with no diplomatic protection, no connection to Soviet official installations, no safety net. These were ghosts. Officers who had undergone years of preparation, learning to think and speak and even dream in English or German, implanted into Western society with legends so deep they had tax records, credit histories, high school reunions they'd actually attended. The stakes for these operatives were existential. If caught, they faced American federal prisons with no prisoner exchange to hope for. They were expendable assets deployed for maximum strategic gain. Rudolf Albert Herrmann represented the apex of this illegal program, though in April 1978 his name meant nothing to the CIA's Soviet division or the FBI's Washington field office. His legend, the constructed identity he inhabited, was flawless. Born in Frankfurt, immigrated to Canada in 1959, moved to the United States in 1968, worked in advertising with clients in the Mid-Atlantic region. He paid taxes. He attended his son's Little League games. He and Inga hosted barbecues where they served bratwurst and made jokes about German efficiency. Neighbors considered them pleasant, if somewhat reserved, the kind of people who smiled across property lines but never became intimate friends. The man inhabiting this legend was actually Rudolf Ivanovich Herrmann, born in 1932 in Moscow, son of a German communist who'd fled to the Soviet Union after Hitler's rise to power. He'd been talent spotted at Moscow State University, where his natural linguistic ability and ice-water temperament caught the attention of First Chief Directorate recruiters. By 1955, he was enrolled in the KGB's elite training facility near Yurlovo, 20 kilometers outside Moscow, a place that didn't appear on any map. For 4 years, he'd learned to be American, not just to speak English without accent, but to understand baseball statistics, to know the difference between Methodist and Baptist doctrine, to recognize every model of Ford and Chevrolet on site. He'd memorized entire issues of Life magazine. He'd practiced ordering coffee at fake diners where instructors evaluated whether he said cream or milk, whether he overtipped or undertipped. In 1959, Herman had emigrated to Canada using his German legend, spending 9 years establishing a verifiable history before the KGB gave him the assignment that would define his career. Penetrate the Washington, D.C. power structure as deeply as possible while appearing to be exactly what he claimed. A moderately successful immigrant pursuing the American dream. His controller, operating from the KGB's New York residency undercover as a UN translator, gave him a simple directive. Get close to people who mattered and wait for opportunities. By 1971, Herman had found the perfect operational base, a Georgetown townhouse that he'd bought with cash explained as inheritance from his deceased father in Germany. The location wasn't accidental. Within a 6-block radius, Herman had access to 4 different metro stations, 3 major bus lines, and direct sight lines to the homes of 2 sitting senators, a Supreme Court clerk, and 17 mid-level State Department analysts. He'd chosen the advertising profession for its flexibility. No fixed office hours, no colleagues monitoring his daily routine, legitimate reasons to travel frequently. His company, Herman Associates Consulting, existed on paper and in the minds of a handful of satisfied clients who never suspected their consultant was photographing their trash and memorizing the names mentioned during casual conversation. What made Herman exceptional wasn't just his cover, but his patience. Many illegals, pressed by Moscow Center to produce results, became aggressive in their recruitment attempts and triggered counterintelligence warnings. Herman played a longer game. He joined the National Press Club, not as a journalist, but as an associate member through his advertising work. He volunteered for a German-American cultural society. He became a familiar face at certain K Street restaurants where government officials ate lunch. He never pushed. He listened, remembered, and reported through a communication system so secure that even the FBI's most intensive surveillance would miss it entirely. His primary handler, a KGB major named Yuri Drozdov, operating under the cryptonym Deputy, had designed a communication protocol that avoided every known FBI detection method. Herman never met Soviet officials. He never visited the embassy. He never made calls to suspicious numbers. Instead, he used a system of dead drops scattered across the greater Washington area. Hollow bricks in forgotten walls, magnetic containers stuck under park benches, weatherproof pouches buried in suburban gardens. His intelligence reports, written on water-soluble paper and photographed with the Minox B camera disguised as a cigarette lighter, would be placed in these locations following protocols that changed monthly according to a pre-memorized calendar. The geopolitical stakes of Herman's operation, though invisible to casual observers, were extraordinary. The late 1970s represented a precarious moment in the Cold War's nuclear dimension. The SALT II negotiations were approaching their final phase, with Carter and Brezhnev's teams arguing over verification protocols and throw-weight calculations. The accuracy of Soviet intelligence on American nuclear posture, specifically the Pentagon's real capabilities versus its public claims, could determine whether Moscow accepted treaty limitations or pushed for more advantageous terms. One well-placed source with access to genuine planning documents could reshape the entire negotiation. Herman had cultivated exactly such a source, though even he didn't initially recognize the man's potential value. In 1975, at a German-American Society wine tasting, he'd befriended a Defense Intelligence Agency analyst named Thomas, who collected first-edition German philosophy texts. Their friendship developed slowly, naturally, around shared interests in Kant and Heidegger, weekend conversations about Nietzsche's influence on modern thought. Thomas never knew that Rudy's philosophical insights came from intensive KGB coaching, that every recommendation for books and discussion topics had been carefully designed to build rapport with a specific personality type. By 1977, Thomas trusted Rudy enough to complain, during a particularly wine-lubricated evening, about the frustrations of his work. The political pressure to inflate Soviet capabilities, the way intelligence assessments got twisted to support preferred policies. He never provided specific documents. He didn't need to. His observations about what his office was being asked to analyze gave Herman's handlers in Moscow Center a roadmap of American intelligence priorities. When Thomas mentioned, almost in passing, that his team had been tasked with assessing Soviet mobile ICBM accuracy, the KGB's Strategic Rocket Forces Division learned something invaluable. The Americans were worried about first strike vulnerability, which meant they believed their Minuteman silos might be at risk. That single piece of information, filtered through Herman's reporting, influenced Soviet military planning for the next 5 years. But by April 1978, Herman's nearly perfect operation was developing hairline fractures he couldn't detect. The FBI's Washington field office had opened a new investigation codenamed Garden Plot, triggered not by Herman himself, but by a pattern analysts had noticed in the previous 18 months. 3 separate Defense Department employees with no apparent connection to each other had all shown subtle signs of possible compromise. Unexplained cash deposits, sudden interest in topics outside their work portfolios, minor security violations that seemed uncharacteristic. The violations were too small to prosecute, but too consistent to ignore. Counterintelligence specialists suspected a sophisticated network was operating, but they had no entry point, no thread to pull that might unravel the structure. Margaret Chen's phone call landed in this investigative environment like a seed in prepared soil. The FBI agent who took her report, a methodical 20-year veteran named Robert Denton, had spent the previous 3 months reviewing surveillance logs from the neighborhoods surrounding the White House, looking for anomalies. A foreign-accented resident working in advertising with irregular hours and expensive shoes warranted a closer look. Within 48 hours, Denton had initiated a preliminary background check. Within a week, he'd found the first discrepancy. Herman's claimed employment history in Canada before 1968 had gaps that didn't quite align with his tax records. The gaps weren't obvious, they required comparing multiple document sets, but they were there. The truth hiding beneath Rudolf Herman's suburban normalcy was an operational architecture that represented 20 years of KGB innovation and tradecraft. What made it nearly invisible to American counterintelligence was its radio silence, literally. Most Soviet intelligence networks relied heavily on radio communication, using one-time pads and scheduled broadcasts to transmit information. These broadcasts, even when encrypted, created signals that the NSA's monitoring stations could detect and analyze. Traffic analysis might not reveal content, but it revealed that communication was happening, which gave counterintelligence teams something to investigate. Herman's network communicated almost entirely through dead drops and personal courier systems, with one crucial exception. A shortwave radio concealed in his basement, disguised as a high-end stereo component, capable of receiving, but never transmitting, coded messages from a KGB station in Cuba. The receive-only design was brilliant. The FBI could surveil his house for radio transmissions indefinitely and find nothing because nothing was being transmitted. The radio received encrypted numerical broadcasts every Tuesday and Thursday at 11:17 p.m., messages that sounded like random number sequences to anyone listening but contained operational instructions for Herman when decoded using one-time pads hidden in the lining of his son's baseball glove. The decoded messages in early 1978 revealed Moscow Center's increasing urgency. The Carter administration was pressuring Congress to approve new weapons systems, the MX missile, the Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missile, cruise missile deployments in Europe. The KGB desperately needed insight into the administration's actual commitment to these programs versus their rhetorical positioning. Were they negotiating tools or genuine military priorities? The difference would determine whether the Soviet Union needed to accelerate its own costly weapons programs, or could accept strategic parity agreements. Herman had been tasked with determining the answer through his expanding network. By April 1978, he was running 4 active sources, though running overstated his control. He preferred the term cultivating. Beyond Thomas at DIA, he had access to a State Department translator who had mentioned insights into the SALT II negotiating team's internal debates, a Pentagon cost analyst who complained about budget pressure to minimize program expenses, and a congressional staffer who'd grown disillusioned with what she viewed as militaristic policies. None of these individuals knew they were intelligence sources. They thought they were friends sharing frustrations with a sympathetic listener who happened to be interested in politics. The technical sophistication of Herman's operation extended beyond radio systems and dead drops. His Minox B camera, no bigger than a cigarette lighter, could photograph documents at a resolution sufficient to read 8-point type. He'd developed techniques for rapid photography during social gatherings, a technique practiced in the Yurlovo training facility until it became unconscious reflex. At Thomas's apartment, while his friend prepared coffee in the kitchen, Herman had once photographed 3 pages of a classified briefing book left on a desk, 12 shots in 18 seconds, the camera's mechanical click covered by running water and his own strategic coughing. The film cartridges, each containing 50 exposures, were then hidden in a false compartment in his car's air filter housing, a location no casual search would reveal. But the KGB's greatest technical achievement in Herman's case wasn't the equipment, it was the legend documentation. Soviet intelligence had learned from past failures that illegals needed verifiable histories with depth that could withstand investigation. Herman's Canadian period from 1959 to 1968 wasn't simply a cover story, it was a constructed reality. The KGB had actually enrolled him in a Toronto advertising agency under his legend name, where he'd worked genuine accounts and built real professional relationships. His former colleagues in Canada, if contacted by investigators, would remember him clearly because he'd actually been there. His apartment lease, his bank accounts, his doctor visits, all real, all documented. The investment in this deep cover legend had cost Soviet intelligence hundreds of thousands of dollars and taken years to establish, but it created a foundation that could withstand significant scrutiny. The chess game between the FBI's counterintelligence division and the KGB's illegals program had been running for decades by 1978, but it was fundamentally asymmetric. The FBI operated with legal constraints, court oversight, and bureaucratic procedures that slowed investigations. The KGB operated with near unlimited resources, no legal restrictions, and a willingness to sacrifice individuals for operational success. But the FBI had home field advantage. They knew the landscape, controlled the infrastructure, and could deploy surveillance resources the KGB couldn't match. When Robert Denton's preliminary investigation of Rudolf Herrmann began in late April 1978, it followed protocols designed to avoid alerting the target. No overt contact, no interviews with neighbors that might get back to Herrmann, no obvious surveillance vehicles. Instead, Denton requested what the FBI called light touch monitoring, periodic observation from a distance, review of financial records through quiet subpoenas to banks, analysis of phone records without wiretaps. The goal was to either clear Herrmann as a person of interest or develop sufficient evidence to justify more intensive investigation. What Denton found in those first 2 weeks didn't confirm espionage, but it amplified concern. Herrmann's travel patterns showed unexplained trips to Philadelphia, Richmond, and Baltimore, cities with no apparent connection to his advertising clients. His bank deposits showed irregular cash income that exceeded what his documented business accounts would generate. His phone records revealed almost no long-distance calls, which was unusual for someone supposedly running a regional consulting business. Most intriguingly, surveillance teams noticed that Herrmann seemed to follow counter-surveillance protocols, varying his routes home, occasionally making abrupt turns or U-turns, parking in locations with clear sightlines to approaches. These weren't definitive indicators of espionage, but they were behaviors the FBI had documented in known intelligence officers. The breakthrough came from a source the FBI hadn't anticipated, the Department of Motor Vehicles. A junior analyst in the FBI's Washington field office, following up on Herrmann's vehicle registrations, noticed that his Ford Granada had been purchased with cash in 1975. The title transferred from a Maryland dealer with no financing records. This was unusual enough to warrant checking the dealer's records. The dealership had been closed since 1976, but archived sales documents revealed something odd. Herrmann had paid $4,200 in cash for a car with a retail value of $5,800. The dealer's notation suggested the sale was as-is, special circumstance, language that sometimes indicated a transaction that benefited both parties in non-obvious ways. Cross-referencing the dealership's other sales in 1975, the FBI analyst found 3 other similar transactions: cash sales at below-market prices to buyers with Eastern European surnames, none of whom had financing despite purchasing in a period when 87% of car buyers used loans. One of those buyers, a man named Peter Fisher, had been identified 2 years earlier as a possible KGB support agent, someone who provided logistical assistance to intelligence operations without being an actual intelligence officer. The connection was circumstantial but suggestive. Was the dealership serving as some kind of service organization for Soviet operations? By mid-May 1978, Denton had authorization to escalate the investigation. Herrmann was placed under sustained surveillance, not the light-touch monitoring of April, but around-the-clock teams rotating in 8-hour shifts. His phone lines were tapped following a FISA court order obtained through testimony about the circumstantial evidence accumulating against him. The FBI's Technical Services Division installed a laser microphone system targeted at his living room window, a technology that could read vibrations in glass to reconstruct conversations inside. And most significantly, Denton requested that the NSA's Signal Intelligence Division review any radio intercepts from the greater Washington area that might correlate with Herrmann's activity patterns. The NSA analysis revealed something unexpected: no suspicious transmissions from Herrmann's location, but a pattern of encoded shortwave broadcasts originating from Cuba on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, transmissions that had been occurring for years but had never been connected to specific operations. The broadcasts used a format called number stations, mysterious radio signals that transmitted sequences of numbers in various languages, presumed to be coded messages for intelligence operatives but never definitively attributed. The NSA had been logging these particular transmissions since 1971 under the designation Station Charlie 7. They occurred at 11:17 p.m. Eastern Time, lasted approximately 7 minutes, and repeated the same numerical sequences twice before signing off. If Herrmann was receiving these broadcasts, he would need a sophisticated radio and decryption materials. The FBI's next move required extreme care. They needed to search his residence without his knowledge, a black bag job that would either confirm or refute the espionage hypothesis. On June 2nd, 1978, while the Herman family was attending a weekend soccer tournament in Alexandria where their son was playing, an FBI technical entry team spent 4 hours inside their Georgetown townhouse. They photographed everything, disturbed nothing, and discovered what counterintelligence officers later described as a masterclass in tradecraft. The shortwave radio was hidden in plain sight, built into a Marantz 2275 stereo receiver that looked entirely normal. Only disassembly revealed the additional circuit boards capable of receiving specific frequency ranges. The one-time pads, the encryption keys needed to decode the radio messages, were concealed in a way the FBI team almost missed, sewn into the leather lining of a baseball glove that hung in the son's closet, accessible only by carefully cutting and resealing the stitching. The Minox camera was found in a false bottom of Herman's briefcase, along with 12 unexposed film cartridges and 3 exposed rolls awaiting development. But perhaps most damaging, the FBI team photographed a handwritten document in Herman's study that appeared to be notes from a conversation about Defense Department budget priorities, with references to T mentioned and MX program cost concerns. The T almost certainly referred to Thomas, the DIA analyst. The FBI now had evidence sufficient for arrest, but Denton and his supervisors faced a critical decision: arrest Herman immediately and risk losing the opportunity to identify his full network, or continue surveillance to map his contacts and roll up the entire operation. The choice reflected a fundamental tension in counterintelligence work: the tactical victory of catching one spy versus the strategic gain of understanding an entire system. After consultation with CIA counterintelligence and the Justice Department's Internal Security Division, the decision was made to continue surveillance while simultaneously investigating Herman's known associates. This decision nearly proved disastrous because the KGB had its own indicators that something was wrong. In Moscow Center, the first chief directorate's American department had grown concerned about the lack of recent reporting from Herman. His last dead drop deposit had been May 15th, containing routine observational intelligence, but nothing of the quality they'd come to expect. His handler in New York, operating under the cryptonym Deputy, had attempted to initiate contact through the normal protocols: a chalk mark on a specific mailbox in Georgetown that signaled the need for an emergency meeting. But Herman hadn't responded. By early June, Moscow Center was debating whether to activate an evacuation protocol or assume that Herman was simply being cautious about increased security around Washington during the ongoing SALT II negotiations. What saved the FBI's investigation was a stroke of extraordinary luck, combined with Herman's own professional discipline. On June 14, 1978, Herman was scheduled to service a dead drop location in Rock Creek Park, a hollow in a specific oak tree where he would retrieve instructions from his handler. FBI surveillance teams, now aware of his operational patterns, had identified 3 possible dead drop locations through intensive analysis of his movement patterns. They'd installed covert cameras at each location, systems that could operate for weeks on battery power while recording any activity near the drops. At 6:47 a.m. on June 14th, Rudolf Herrmann approached the oak tree on what appeared to be a morning jog. The FBI's camera captured him checking for surveillance, waiting for 3 minutes to ensure no one was watching, then reaching into the hollow to retrieve a small waterproof container. He pocketed the container without opening it, continued his jog, and returned home 30 minutes later. The surveillance footage was exactly what the FBI needed: proof of operational activity, visual documentation of tradecraft, and confirmation that Herman was actively engaged in intelligence operations, not merely a dormant agent or false positive. But the container itself presented a problem. Herman had retrieved it, which meant the FBI couldn't examine its contents without alerting him that his operation was compromised. The investigation had reached a critical juncture: continue observing and risk losing control of the situation, or move toward arrest and accept that the full scope of his network might never be understood. The decision point came from an unexpected angle. On June 19, 1978, Thomas, the DIA analyst Herman had cultivated, contacted the FBI voluntarily through his agency's security office. He reported that he'd been having doubts about his friendship with Rudy Herman, specifically about Rudy's unusual interest in his work at DIA and his tendency to ask questions that seemed innocently curious but were actually quite specific. Thomas had done something his security training recommended, but that most people ignored. He had started keeping notes about what Rudy asked and when. Reviewing those notes, he'd realized that the questions corresponded almost precisely with his office's classified work topics. The correlation was too consistent to be coincidental. Thomas's voluntary report changed everything. The FBI now had a cooperative witness inside Herman's network, someone who could provide direct testimony about recruitment techniques and intelligence objectives. More importantly, the FBI could use Thomas to control what information flowed to Herman, effectively turning the relationship into a double-agent operation. The decision was made: arrest Herman before he could be warned by Moscow Center that something was wrong, but do so in a way that might convince him cooperation was his best option. The arrest occurred on June 21st, 1978, at 6:15 a.m. in a carefully choreographed operation designed to minimize risk and maximize psychological impact. As Herman left his townhouse for his morning jog, the same routine the FBI had documented dozens of times, 3 vehicles converged on his position. FBI special agents wearing blue windbreakers with the Bureau's insignia clearly visible approached from multiple angles, weapons drawn but pointed down. The team leader, Robert Denton himself, spoke clearly. "Rudolph Herman, FBI, you're under arrest for espionage. Keep your hands visible." What happened in the next 30 seconds revealed something about Herman's training and temperament. He didn't run, he didn't resist, he didn't claim innocence or demand to call a lawyer. Instead, according to the arrest report, he stood absolutely still, assessed the situation with what Denton later described as professional recognition, and asked a single question: "Is my family safe?" When Denton confirmed that his wife and son were not being arrested, Herman nodded once and said, "I'll cooperate, but I need certain assurances." The statement was remarkable for what it revealed. Herman immediately recognized that his operation was irretrievably compromised, that resistance was pointless, and that his only leverage was information the FBI wanted. He was negotiating from the moment of his arrest, displaying a psychological resilience and tactical awareness that impressed even his captors. This wasn't a caught spy panicking. This was a professional intelligence officer transitioning from one operational phase to another. During the initial interrogation conducted in a secure facility in Quantico, Virginia, Herman confirmed the FBI's suspicions while carefully calibrating what he revealed. Yes, he was a KGB illegal. Yes, he'd been operating in the United States since 1968. Yes, he'd been cultivating sources with access to classified information, but he refused to identify specific sources beyond Thomas, whose voluntary contact with the FBI he'd obviously been informed about. He wouldn't describe his communication protocols in detail. He wouldn't identify his handlers or their locations. He was cooperating enough to demonstrate good faith while preserving leverage for negotiation. What the FBI didn't immediately realize was that Herman's arrest had triggered a crisis within the KGB's American operations. When he failed to make a scheduled signal on June 22nd, a chalk mark that should have appeared on a mailbox in DuPont Circle, his New York handler knew something catastrophic had occurred. The handler, Yuri Drozdov, faced a terrible choice: attempt to warn other elements of the network and risk exposing them to FBI surveillance, or assume they were already compromised and focus on damage control. He chose the latter, immediately activating an emergency protocol that warned 2 other illegals operating on the East Coast to cease all activities and prepare for possible evacuation. But the KGB's response had a critical weakness. Their communication security had been built around the assumption that illegals wouldn't be detected, so emergency protocols involved physical signals and dead drops that required time to check. One of the illegals who received the warning, operating in Northern Virginia, made a crucial mistake. He attempted to clear out a safe deposit box containing operational materials without first ensuring he wasn't under surveillance. The FBI, now running an intensive effort to identify Herman's network connections, had put surveillance on every individual he'd had contact with in the previous 6 months, including a German businessman named Klaus Richter, who'd appeared at the same German-American Society events. Richter's sudden visit to a safe deposit box in Arlington, his nervous demeanor, and his subsequent drive to Baltimore flagged him as a priority target. When FBI agents obtained a warrant to examine the safe deposit box after Richter's visit, they found it cleaned out. But bank records showed he'd maintained the box since 1973 and visited it quarterly until this sudden access. The pattern was consistent with an operational safe house or materials cache. Richter was placed under intensive surveillance, a decision that would, within 3 weeks, lead the FBI to 2 more illegals and a support network of 5 individuals providing logistical assistance to Soviet intelligence operations. The domino effect of Herman's arrest revealed something that had long been suspected but never proven. The KGB was running multiple illegal residencies in the United States simultaneously, networks that occasionally overlapped for support purposes but were generally compartmentalized. Herman's network was designated Garden, the FBI's investigative code name. The networks connected to Richter were designated Arbor and Forest. By August 1978, the FBI had identified 12 individuals with probable connections to KGB illegal operations, the largest single breakthrough in Soviet illegals since World War II. But the most significant revelation from Herman's interrogation wasn't about other spies. It was about the sophistication of Soviet illegal programs and the institutional commitment required to sustain them. During weeks of debriefing, Herman described the training facility at Yurlevo, the years of preparation before deployment, the support infrastructure in Canada and the United States that had facilitated his legend building. He explained the psychological screening process that selected illegals for resilience and adaptability. He detailed the communication systems, the dead drop protocols, the financial support mechanisms. In essence, he provided a graduate-level education in how the KGB ran deep cover operations. The FBI and CIA analysts who debriefed Herman came away with a disturbing conclusion. American counterintelligence had been dramatically underestimating the scale and sophistication of Soviet illegal operations. The assumption had been that illegals were rare, expensive, and reserved for the most critical operations. Herman's testimony suggested otherwise, that the KGB had dozens of illegals operating in the United States at any given time, that they were supported by extensive infrastructure, and that they represented a strategic intelligence capability that American security services had failed to fully appreciate. The question of what happened to Herman's recruited sources, particularly the individuals beyond Thomas who had unknowingly provided information, became a sensitive internal debate. Thomas faced no criminal charges. He'd voluntarily reported his concerns and hadn't knowingly provided classified information to a foreign agent. But his career at DIA effectively ended. He was reassigned to a non-sensitive position analyzing historical data, his security clearance reduced to a level that barred him from current intelligence. The other individuals in Herman's network faced various consequences depending on what prosecutors could prove about their knowledge and intent. The State Department translator lost her position but wasn't prosecuted. The Pentagon cost analyst faced administrative penalties but no criminal charges. The congressional staffer's case was particularly delicate. Prosecuting her risked exposing classified methods the FBI had used in the investigation. The documents declassified in subsequent years, a process that began in 1992 after the Cold War's end and continued through 2008, painted a remarkable picture of operational success undermined by a single observant neighbor. The CIA's official history of the case, partially released in 2003, noted that Herman had achieved the deepest penetration of the Washington policy establishment by a Soviet illegal since World War II, providing Moscow Center with strategic insight into American nuclear posture and arms control positions during a critical phase of SALT II negotiations. An internal KGB assessment obtained by American intelligence after the Soviet Union's collapse rated Herman's operation as exemplary in tradecraft, but noted that no system of operational security can fully protect against random human observation by trained individuals. Margaret Chen's background at the State Department had given her exactly the observational skills needed to notice what professional counterintelligence officers had missed. Herman himself became one of the most valuable defectors in FBI history, though his cooperation was pragmatic rather than ideological. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to espionage charges, but his sentence was quietly reduced to 8 years in recognition of his extensive debriefing assistance. He provided information that helped the FBI identify weaknesses in its counterintelligence procedures, vulnerabilities in background check processes, and gaps in surveillance coverage that the KGB had exploited. His insights contributed to a wholesale reform of how American security services approached the illegal threat. The broader strategic impact of Herman's exposure rippled through the intelligence community for years. The CIA's Soviet division realized that their assumptions about KGB illegal capabilities needed fundamental revision. The FBI restructured its counterintelligence program to focus more resources on identifying illegals rather than just monitoring diplomatic personnel. The NSA intensified its focus on number stations and encrypted shortwave communications. Perhaps most significantly, the case led to improved coordination between agencies. The FBI, CIA, NSA, and military intelligence services began sharing information more freely about suspected illegals, creating a joint task force that hadn't existed before. In Moscow Center, the loss of Herman's network was viewed as a catastrophic failure. The first chief directorate conducted an extensive damage assessment, trying to understand how an operation that had been so carefully planned and executed could unravel. The conclusion, according to later accounts from KGB defectors, was sobering. Even perfect tradecraft couldn't eliminate human factors. An illegal's most vulnerable moment wasn't during operational acts like servicing dead drops or meeting agents. Those activities could be secured through training and protocols. The vulnerability was in daily life, in the accumulated small details that formed a pattern visible to someone paying attention. The KGB responded by revising its illegal training program, adding even more emphasis on cultural immersion and behavioral consistency. But they also recognized a fundamental limitation. The longer an illegal operated in deep cover, the more exposure points accumulated, and eventually statistical probability worked against operational security. The calculus shifted toward shorter-term illegal operations or hybrid models that combined illegal and legal residency elements. For American policymakers, Herman's case arrived at a pivotal moment in arms control negotiations. The SALT II Treaty was signed in June 1979, just a year after his arrest, and the intelligence he'd provided to Moscow had influenced Soviet positions during the final negotiating phase. American negotiators never knew with certainty what classified information had reached Soviet hands through Herman's network, which created lingering doubts about whether the treaty terms adequately protected American interests. These doubts contributed to the Senate's eventual refusal to ratify SALT II, though the treaty's provisions were largely observed by both sides through the 1980s. The human cost of the case extended beyond Herman himself. His wife Inga, who'd known her husband's real identity but had no operational role, faced deportation proceedings. Their son, who'd been entirely unaware of his father's true occupation, suffered psychological trauma that FBI counselors documented as severe identity disruption. The boy had believed he was American, the son of a German immigrant with a straightforward family history. Learning that his father was a Soviet spy, that his life had been a constructed illusion, and that his identity was partly fiction, triggered a crisis that required years of therapy to address. In later interviews, conducted decades later when he'd built a new life under a different name, he described the experience as learning that reality itself could be fake. The specific technological legacies of Herman's case were significant. The FBI's Technical Services Division studied the concealment methods they'd discovered in his residence, particularly the radio hidden in the stereo receiver and the one-time pads sewn into the baseball glove. These became teaching examples in counterintelligence training, demonstrating the level of sophistication that agents needed to look for. The Minox camera techniques Herman had used, rapid photography of documents during social situations, led to new document security protocols in government offices, including requirements that classified materials never be left visible when non-cleared individuals might be present, even briefly. The case also influenced how the FBI approached neighborhood surveillance and community reporting. Margaret Chen's observation had been crucial, but she'd hesitated for days before calling it in, uncertain whether her suspicion was legitimate or xenophobic paranoia. The FBI developed new community outreach programs designed to help citizens understand what kinds of observations were genuinely useful versus which were simply ethnic profiling. The line was delicate, encouraging vigilance without encouraging discrimination, teaching people to notice behavioral patterns rather than accents or appearances. The dead drop locations Herman had used became a subject of extensive analysis. FBI teams cataloged 23 different locations he'd serviced over 7 years: hollows in trees, loose bricks in walls, magnetic containers under park benches, waterproof pouches in storm drains. The geographic distribution of these locations revealed operational patterns. They clustered around areas with high government employee density. They avoided locations with security cameras or heavy police presence, and they were positioned to allow quick access from multiple transit routes. The study of these patterns led to the development of algorithmic tools that could identify probable dead drop locations based on geographic and demographic factors, an early application of data analysis to counterintelligence work. One particularly haunting detail emerged from declassified KGB documents obtained after the Cold War. Moscow Center had been planning to extract Herman in late 1979, recognizing that 7 years of deep cover operation was approaching the practical limit of sustainable risk. His value had been so high that they'd intended to bring him back to Moscow for a senior training position, where he could pass his expertise to the next generation of illegals. The extraction plan, codenamed Harvest, would have involved a gradual wind-down of his American life, selling the Georgetown townhouse, explaining to neighbors that his company was expanding to Europe. A believable exit that would leave no traces. If Margaret Chen had made her phone call 6 months later, or if the FBI's investigation had moved more slowly, Herman might have disappeared without the Americans ever confirming his true identity. The irony wasn't lost on intelligence professionals. The most successful Soviet spy in Washington's heart had been undone not by sophisticated counterintelligence operations, not by signals intelligence or diplomatic source reporting, but by a retired State Department protocol officer who noticed that her neighbor's accent didn't quite match his claimed biography. The entire architecture of technical surveillance, data analysis, and bureaucratic investigation had been activated by human observation, a grandmother with sharp ears and sharper instincts drinking coffee at her kitchen window. By late 1978, the FBI's investigation had expanded into what became known internally as Operation Family Tree, a systematic effort to map and neutralize Soviet illegal networks across the United States. Herman's cooperation had provided the starting point, but the investigation developed momentum beyond his direct knowledge. The FBI's strategy involved a careful balance: arrest illegals who posed immediate security threats while surveilling others to understand the full network architecture. This approach paid dividends in October 1978 when surveillance of Klaus Richter, the illegal initially identified through connection to Herman, revealed contact with a New York-based Austrian businessman who was subsequently identified as yet another illegal, operating under the cryptonym Forrest. The Forrest network's exposure demonstrated how compartmentalized yet interconnected Soviet illegal operations were. Forrest had no direct operational connection to Herman. They'd never met, never communicated, and ran separate agent networks. but they shared support infrastructure, specifically a document forger in Philadelphia who provided high-quality false identification to multiple KGB operations. The forger, a former East German intelligence officer who'd immigrated to the United States in 1965, was himself an illegal with the sole function of supporting other operations. His arrest in December 1978 yielded a treasure trove of materials: blank identity documents, photograph of dozens of individuals, and crucially, a ledger written in code that, once decrypted, revealed the dates and types of documents he'd provided since 1968. The ledger became a Rosetta Stone for American counterintelligence. Cross-referencing the dates with other investigation files allowed the FBI to identify several individuals who'd obtained false documents during suspicious periods, including 2 people who'd subsequently gained employment at defense contractors and one who'd worked at the Department of Energy's Nuclear Security Division. The breadth of Soviet intelligence operations became clear. This wasn't a handful of isolated spies, but an ecosystem of illegals, support agents, and recruited sources forming a capability that had evolved over decades. Yet even as the FBI rolled up these networks, uncomfortable questions emerged about what had been missed. If Herman had operated successfully for 7 years in Georgetown, if Richter had maintained a business front in Virginia since 1970, if the Philadelphia forger had supported operations since 1965, how many other illegals were still undiscovered? The FBI's Counterintelligence Division attempted to estimate the size of the unknown illegal population using statistical modeling. Their classified assessment, produced in early 1979, suggested between 40 and 60 Soviet illegals were likely operating in the United States at any given time, with perhaps 100 to 150 support agents facilitating their work. This was 4 to 5 times higher than previous estimates, a realization that sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. The Carter administration faced a political dilemma about how to handle the revelations publicly. Admitting the scope of Soviet illegal operations risked appearing weak on national security, but using the cases to justify increased counterintelligence resources required some level of public disclosure. The compromise was a carefully managed leak to the New York Times in March 1979, detailing Herman's arrest and suggesting it was part of a major FBI counterintelligence success without revealing the full scope of what had been discovered. The article prompted a wave of congressional hearings about counterintelligence adequacy and led to increased funding for the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. Rudolf Herman himself remained in federal custody throughout this period, housed in a special facility designed for intelligence defectors and high-value prisoners. His debriefings continued for more than 2 years, sessions that were sometimes cordial and sometimes tense as FBI and CIA interrogators pushed for more details about KGB operations. One CIA officer who participated in these sessions later described Herman as the most professional intelligence officer I've encountered on either side. He understood exactly what he could trade and what he needed to protect. He never lied to us, but he was selective with truth in ways that served his interests. The selectivity became apparent in 1981 when Herman revealed information he'd withheld during earlier debriefings. He disclosed that the KGB had placed at least 3 illegals in academic institutions, universities where they could influence the next generation of policymakers while appearing to be faculty members with no connection to intelligence work. The revelation triggered a new FBI investigation, codenamed Ivory Tower, which eventually identified 2 Soviet illegals working as professors, one at a mid-Atlantic university and another on the West Coast. Both had been teaching courses on Soviet politics and foreign policy, using their academic positions to identify and assess potential recruitment targets among students who might eventually enter government service. The academic illegals represented a long-term strategic approach that was particularly concerning to American security officials. Unlike Herman, whose operation focused on immediate intelligence collection, these illegals were building networks and influence that might not pay dividends for years or even decades. They were planting seeds, cultivating relationships with students who might not enter positions of access for 10 or 15 years. This patient generational approach to intelligence collection suggested a level of strategic thinking and resource commitment that challenged American assumptions about Soviet intelligence priorities. Herman's most valuable contribution to American counterintelligence may have been his detailed description of the psychological assessment process the KGB used to select illegal candidates. He explained that the First Chief Directorate looked for specific personality traits: emotional stability under pressure, ability to maintain multiple identities without psychological stress, comfort with deception without guilt, capacity for patience over years of operation, and perhaps most importantly, what he called controlled compartmentalization, the ability to keep operational knowledge separate from personal relationships. He described screening tests that evaluated these traits, including scenarios where candidates had to maintain cover stories under hostile interrogation and long-term monitoring to assess whether candidates developed behavioral inconsistencies between their real and assumed identities. This information allowed American counterintelligence to develop a psychological profile of the typical Soviet illegal, which in turn influenced how the FBI approached investigations. Rather than looking primarily for suspicious activities, investigators could now consider personality and behavioral patterns. Individuals who seemed to have few deep friendships, who maintained almost perfect consistency in their routines, who showed unusual interest in specific topics without professional justification, who had life histories that seemed slightly too perfect or too well documented. These indicators weren't evidence of espionage by themselves, but they could identify candidates for more intensive investigation. The CIA's assessment of the damage Herman's network had caused was sobering. In the realm of nuclear strategy and arms control, his reporting to Moscow had given Soviet negotiators insight into American positions that likely affected SALT II outcomes. Specifically, the information Thomas had inadvertently provided about American concerns regarding Soviet mobile ICBM accuracy had revealed a vulnerability in American strategic thinking. The Soviets had learned that the United States was genuinely worried about its land-based missiles' survivability, which gave them leverage in negotiations about counting rules and verification. While it's impossible to quantify the exact impact, CIA analysts estimated that information from Herman's network had shifted certain treaty provisions by perhaps 5 to 10% in the Soviet Union's favor, seemingly small margins that represented significant strategic value when applied to weapon systems and verification protocols. Beyond arms control, Herman's operation had compromised American intelligence collection methods. His reporting had included details about how his sources described their work processes, which inadvertently revealed U.S. intelligence priorities and methods. For instance, Thomas's complaints about being asked to assess Soviet mobile missile accuracy told Moscow that the Americans had some method of tracking Soviet missile movements, information that led to improved Soviet operational security around missile deployments. This counterintelligence effect, where intelligence operations inadvertently reveal the intelligence collector's capabilities, represented a second-order damage that was harder to measure but potentially more significant than the direct information compromise. The handling of Herman's case also influenced how the FBI approached future defections and cooperation arrangements. His negotiation from the moment of arrest, his careful calibration of what he revealed, and his ultimate willingness to provide extensive information in exchange for reduced sentencing created a template for how the FBI would work with captured illegals going forward. The Bureau developed formal protocols for these negotiations, including standardized terms for cooperation and clear guidelines about what kinds of information were most valuable. This systematization of defector management contributed to increased success in subsequent cases throughout the 1980s. One unexpected legacy of the case was its impact on Soviet-American relations during the early Reagan administration. When Reagan took office in 1981, his advisors used information from the Herman case and related investigations to brief the new president on the scope of Soviet intelligence operations. This briefing reportedly influenced Reagan's hardline initial approach to the Soviet Union, contributing to the tense first term of his presidency before the relationship shifted in his second term. The evidence of extensive illegal networks operating in the United States shaped the administration's threat perception and its willingness to confront Soviet activities aggressively. For Margaret Chen, the woman whose phone call had initiated the entire investigation, the aftermath was remarkably low-key. The FBI initially kept her identity confidential, concerned that publicity might put her at risk or discourage other citizens from reporting concerns. She gave no interviews, received no public recognition, and asked for none. In a brief FBI memo from 1980, summarizing her role for the official case file, the agent noted that when thanked for her service to national security, Chen had simply said she'd done what anyone with her background would do. She didn't think she'd observed anything extraordinary, the memo noted. She just thought her neighbor's accent didn't quite fit his story. This modesty obscured the significance of what Chen had demonstrated, that counterintelligence ultimately depends on human beings paying attention. All the technical systems, all the data analysis, all the surveillance technology in the world hadn't detected Herman. What had detected him was a retired bureaucrat with trained observational skills and the civic responsibility to report her concerns. Intelligence professionals drew different lessons from this fact. Some argued it showed the importance of public vigilance, others that it revealed American counterintelligence's worrying dependence on chance. The subsequent careers of the FBI agents involved in Herman's investigation illustrated how the case affected the counterintelligence profession. Robert Denton, the agent who'd initially pursued Margaret Chen's lead, became the FBI's Deputy Assistant Director for Counterintelligence Operations, where he oversaw the Bureau's illegal hunting programs through the mid-1980s. Several other agents who'd worked the case became instructors at the FBI Academy, teaching the next generation of counterintelligence officers using Herman's operation as a primary case study. The investigation's techniques, particularly the methods used to identify dead drop locations and analyze travel patterns, became standard elements of FBI counterintelligence methodology. The legal precedents established by Herman's prosecution also had lasting impact. His case was one of the first to extensively use FISA court warrants for electronic surveillance of a suspected illegal, establishing protocols for how such warrants should be obtained and executed. The standards of evidence required to demonstrate probable cause for FISA surveillance of someone without diplomatic ties to a foreign government became clearer through the Herman case. These legal frameworks, developed in 1978 to 1980, remained largely unchanged for decades and were still being cited in counterintelligence cases in the 21st century. In Moscow, the KGB's response to Herman's exposure and subsequent cooperation was brutal and instructive. The officers who'd supervised his recruitment and operation faced career-ending consequences. Major Yuri Drozdov, who'd served as Herman's handler under the cryptonym Deputy, was recalled from New York and demoted. His career in American operations effectively finished. The entire illegal program underwent a comprehensive review, with some officers arguing that the risks of deep cover illegals no longer justified the intelligence value, given the FBI's improved counterintelligence capabilities. But the KGB didn't abandon illegal operations. Instead, they adapted. Subsequent illegals received more extensive training in counter-surveillance and behavioral consistency. The communication protocols were revised to eliminate even the receive-only radio systems that Herman had used, shifting instead to more sophisticated methods like steganography, hiding messages in innocent-appearing digital files, and impersonal communication systems that required no physical meetings or drop servicing. The evolution of Soviet tradecraft in response to Herman's compromise demonstrated the action-reaction cycle that characterized Cold War intelligence operations. The human story of Herman's family received less attention but was perhaps more poignant than the operational details. Inga Herman, deported to East Germany in 1980, gave a single interview to a German magazine in 1983 in which she described the psychological toll of the illegal life. "Every day you wake up and remember that you're lying," she said. "Not just to strangers, but to people you've known for years, to your children, to yourself in small ways. You become so practiced at deception that you forget what it feels like to be completely honest." She died in 1991, just as the Cold War was ending, never having returned to the United States or reconciled with her son, who'd refused to communicate with her after learning the truth of his childhood. That son, whose name was changed and identity protected by the U.S. government, chose a life deliberately opposite to his father's. According to FBI files partially declassified in 2012, he joined the U.S. Army in 1985 and served as a military intelligence analyst, a career choice that FBI psychologists interpreted as an attempt to reclaim agency and authentic identity after a childhood of unknowing complicity and deception. He refused all contact with his father, even when Herman was released from federal prison in 1986 and attempted to initiate communication. The FBI's assessment was clinical. Subject exhibits complete rejection of paternal identity, compensatory attachment to American institutional identity. Rudolf Herman himself lived another 23 years after his release from prison, settling eventually in the Midwest under a new identity provided by the FBI's Witness Protection Program. He gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and maintained absolute silence about his past. FBI agents who'd worked with him during his debriefing occasionally received Christmas cards, signed simply RH, from Midwestern postmarks that confirmed he was alive but gave no details about his circumstances. He died in 2009, a man who'd lived 3 separate identities across 7 decades, his true name unknown to the hospital staff who treated him in his final illness. The archival records of his case remain partially classified even today. The FBI's complete case file runs to more than 18,000 pages, of which approximately 12,000 have been released through various Freedom of Information Act requests and declassification reviews. The still classified portions reportedly include details about KGB communication systems that remain intelligence sensitive, information about specific intelligence sources whose identities must be protected, and damage assessments regarding classified programs that remain active. Historians and journalists have speculated that the redacted materials might reveal even deeper penetrations of American security establishments than have been publicly acknowledged. What the declassified materials do reveal is a portrait of Cold War intelligence operations at their most sophisticated. The investment the KGB made in Herman, years of training, decades of support infrastructure, the resources committed to maintaining his legend, demonstrated how seriously Soviet intelligence took the American target, and the FBI's patient, methodical investigation showed American counterintelligence at its best: careful analysis, legal procedure, and strategic thinking that prioritized understanding over quick arrests. The lasting strategic impact of Herman's case extended beyond the immediate operational damage to Soviet intelligence. The case contributed to a broader shift in how intelligence services thought about illegals programs. In the decades after Herman, both Soviet, Russian, and American intelligence shifted resources away from traditional illegals, deep cover officers living under false identities, and toward what became known as non-official cover, officers, intelligence personnel who worked under legitimate but unofficial arrangements like business positions or academic posts. These NOC officers could provide many of the same intelligence collection capabilities as illegals, but with less investment and risk. The case also influenced American thinking about insider threats and security clearance processes. The ease with which Herman had cultivated sources with access to classified information demonstrated that the threat wasn't just foreign agents, but Americans who might unknowingly compromise secrets through careless relationships. This led to enhanced security training, emphasizing how to recognize when social relationships might be intelligence operations, how to report suspicious inquiries, and how to maintain awareness of what information was being shared in apparently innocent conversations. In the academic literature on intelligence, Herman's case became a canonical example of the illegal resident phenomenon, cited in dozens of books and articles about Cold War espionage. Intelligence studies programs used it as a teaching case for understanding deep cover operations, tradecraft sophistication, and the challenges of counterintelligence. The case demonstrated principles that transcended its specific historical context: the vulnerability of even excellent operational security to chance observation, the importance of patient investigation over dramatic action, and the psychological complexity of living double identities. One particularly interesting analytical debate emerged among intelligence scholars about what Herman's case revealed about the cost-benefit calculation of illegal programs. Some analysts argued that the resources the KGB invested in Herman, estimated at several $1 million over 20 years, could have been more effectively spent on other intelligence methods like signals intelligence or diplomatic source recruitment. Others countered that illegals like Herman provided unique access to policy-level insights that couldn't be obtained through technical collection, making them strategically valuable despite high costs. This debate reflected broader questions about how intelligence resources should be allocated, questions that remain relevant in contemporary intelligence operations. The human rights implications of illegal operations also received more attention after Herman's case became public. Civil liberties advocates pointed out that Herman's son had essentially been used as an unwitting prop in an intelligence operation, raised in a false reality without his knowledge or consent. This raised ethical questions about whether intelligence services should use children in operations, even indirectly. The KGB's practice of building legends that included families, where wives and sometimes children were part of the cover, came under criticism as a human rights violation, treating family members as operational assets rather than autonomous individuals. The counter-argument from intelligence professionals was pragmatic rather than ethical. Illegals with families had more convincing covers and were less likely to trigger suspicion than single operators, but the controversy did lead to some reconsideration of these practices. According to defector reports from the late 1980s, the KGB began using illegals without families more frequently, partly to avoid the complications that families created for operational security, and partly in response to criticism about exploiting children for intelligence purposes. The Georgetown townhouse, where Rudolf Herman had lived for 7 years, stood empty for 14 months after his arrest. The FBI maintained technical surveillance in the property, hoping to catch any KGB officers who might attempt to determine what had happened to their asset. No one came. In November 1979, the property was sold through a government auction purchased by a young attorney who had no knowledge of its history. She renovated extensively, tearing out walls and replacing fixtures, unknowingly destroying the last physical traces of a KGB operation that had functioned at the heart of American power. 46 years after Rudolf Herman's arrest, the house shows no indication of its past. The current owners, a retired congressional aide and her husband, have lived there since 2003. They know the history. A neighbor mentioned it once, and the wife researched it out of curiosity, but they don't think about it often. "It was a long time ago," she said in a 2019 interview with a local historical society. "Different world, though I suppose that's what people thought then too." 3 blocks away, Margaret Chen's former residence is now divided into luxury condominiums. She passed away in 1994, her obituary making no mention of the phone call she'd made on an April morning that had unraveled a Soviet intelligence network. The FBI's internal commendation letter, praising her civic awareness and service to national security, was found among her papers by her daughter, who donated it to the International Spy Museum's collection, where it's occasionally displayed in an exhibit about citizen contributions to counterintelligence. The cold coffee ring Margaret Chen had left on her stack of newspapers that morning in 1978 would have dried and disappeared within hours, an invisible trace of the moment before everything changed. The pattern it left on the Washington Post beneath, newsprint absorbing moisture, paper fibers swelling microscopic amounts, would have been indistinguishable from thousands of other coffee stains on thousands of other mornings. But the consequences of what happened in that moment, the phone call, the investigation, the arrests, the revelations, echoed through the intelligence world for decades. In the National Security Agency's museum at Fort Meade, a display case contains one of the radio receivers used by Soviet illegals in the late 1970s, similar to the one found in Herman's basement. The placard describes the technical specifications and the cryptography systems used for numbers station broadcasts. It doesn't mention that the specific unit on display was recovered from an illegal whose arrest was triggered by investigations stemming from Herman's compromise. The connections between cases, the chain reactions of intelligence successes, aren't always visible in the artifacts that survive. The oak tree in Rock Creek Park, where FBI cameras captured Harriman servicing a dead drop, was blown down in a storm in 1996. The hollow where he'd retrieved his instructions was dissected by Park Service workers clearing the debris, who had no idea that the cavity had once held waterproof containers with orders from Moscow Center. The tree's remains were mulched and scattered across the park's trails, organic material returning to the soil. The location is now marked on FBI counterintelligence training maps as Garden 14, a reference point for teaching agents about dead drop selection and surveillance, though the trainees who study the maps have no physical landmark to visit. In the basement archives of the FBI's Washington field office, the Harriman case files occupy 3 rows of filing cabinets, 18,247 pages organized chronologically from April 1978 through December 1982, when the investigation was officially closed. The folders show the where of frequent reference, counterintelligence officers studying the case for training purposes, attorneys reviewing procedures for legal precedent, historians researching Cold War espionage. The most referenced page in the entire collection is the initial report from Margaret Chen's phone call, a single typewritten page with the case number assigned by the duty officer who took her information. The page has been photocopied so many times for training materials that the original has faded from handling. The Minox camera recovered from Harriman's briefcase eventually made its way to the FBI's training academy, where it was used for years to teach new agents about concealment devices and document photography techniques. It's now in storage, replaced by digital examples that better represent current threats, but it remains cataloged in the evidence inventory with a reference to case number WFO 784156. The film cartridges that were found with it, 3 exposed rolls containing photographs of Thomas's apartment, various documents, and surveillance detection notes, were developed and analyzed, then stored in a temperature-controlled vault where classified photographic evidence is preserved. They will remain classified until 2053, 75 years after the investigation began, by which point everyone involved will be dead. The most enduring legacy of Rudolf Harriman's operation isn't visible in any museum or archive. It exists in the procedures and assumptions of American counterintelligence, in the training that FBI agents receive about illegal operations, in the way security officers brief cleared personnel about the sophistication of foreign intelligence operations. Every State Department employee, every Pentagon analyst, every CIA officer who receives training about protecting classified information hears some version of Harriman's story. The successful illegal who lived among us, the sophisticated operation that ran for years undetected, the neighbor who noticed something wrong. The lesson isn't quite what most people assume. It's not that vigilance always wins, or that the truth inevitably emerges. The lesson is more uncomfortable. Harriman was caught by chance, by a retired bureaucrat's trained instincts and civic responsibility. He'd survived FBI counterintelligence efforts for 7 years. He'd passed every background check, avoided every surveillance operation, executed perfect tradecraft. What exposed him wasn't a systemic failure that better security procedures could prevent. It was an accent that didn't quite match a biography, noticed by someone with the experience to recognize the dissonance. The question that haunts the case isn't what went wrong with Soviet intelligence operations or what went right with American counterintelligence. The question is simpler and more disturbing. How many weren't caught? How many illegals ran perfect operations and were extracted successfully? How many are still there, running operations today under different directives from different intelligence services? The files don't answer these questions. They can't. Intelligence history is written by the failures, by the operations that got caught. The successes remain invisible, classified in archives we don't know exist, or never documented at all because the agents completed their missions and went home. For every Rudolf Harriman exposed by an observant neighbor, how many disappeared into retirement without anyone noticing they'd been there? The Georgetown townhouse stands on a sunny street 3 blocks from the White House, its brick facade indistinguishable from a dozen other row houses on the same block. Inside, the current residents go about their lives, unaware that their home office was once where a KGB illegal photographed classified documents. Their coffee table sits approximately where Harriman kept his shortwave radio hidden in stereo components. Their son's baseball glove hangs in the hall closet, in the same space where another boy's glove once concealed one-time encryption pads. On certain mornings, when the light cuts across Lafayette Square at just the right angle, you can see the White House's north facade from the upper windows, exactly as Rudolf Harriman once saw it. The view hasn't changed, the distance is still 3 blocks. The mechanisms of American power still turn in buildings within walking distance. The coffee has long since gone cold.